Let's talk a bit about the so-called negotiations. I call them so-called because what's happening right now is you have a delegation from Hamas will go to Egypt. Sometimes they go to Doha, to Qatar. You have Israeli officials. Ron Dermer right now is the lead Israeli official that is technically in charge of the negotiations on the Israeli side, which is a shift because throughout much of the genocide, it was the head of Shin Bet and other intelligence officials that were leading the negotiations. Now it's a guy who is essentially kind of a political hitman operating at the direction of Benjamin Netanyahu himself. But Ron Dermer is meeting with the head of Egyptian intelligence. So you have these kind of parallel efforts going on. And on the one hand, you have the Israelis saying, our red line is Hamas needs to formally surrender and that the Gaza Strip needs to be entirely demilitarized as a condition to do anything. And so what Israel has put on the table, and it's being communicated primarily through the Egyptian mediators to Hamas, and I have sources that are saying that the Egyptians are actually putting a lot of pressure on Hamas to accept this kind of a deal. Qatar is another question. The Israelis are really engaged in a propaganda campaign right now against Qatar. The Qatari prime minister gave quite a sharp rebuke to Israel in a press conference with Turkish leader the other day. So there's some question about what exactly is Qatar's stance in this. But what I'm hearing from sources that Egypt is pushing Hamas to accept the deal that falls far short of what Hamas has said is sort of its bottom line of what it would agree to. But to make this simple, what's on the table right now is basically something in the range of a 45-day short-term truce where Hamas would have to give up a lot in terms of what it has described as its red lines. There would be an exchange of Israeli captives for Palestinians that are being held. But in the draft document that we obtained that's being put before Hamas, it seems to supersede that January agreement in its terms. And the January agreement, to remind people, was 3 42-day phases. The first phase, which ended on March 1st, was going to involve an exchange of captives, the resumption of humanitarian aid. That happened. It didn't happen at the levels that was agreed upon, but it did happen. And then within that first couple of weeks of phase one, Israel was supposed to start negotiating with Hamas over the technical implementation of phase two. And phase two was stipulated that all Israeli forces were going to be withdrawn from Gaza and that there were going to be discussions toward a permanent truce that would take hold. And then phase three was going to be a reconstructive phase and a so-called day after phase. And there are questions about what type of body would govern Gaza in the interim ahead of democratic elections. Hamas has said, and yet it keeps getting reported as though they haven't, Hamas has said, we will step down as the governing authority of Gaza. That's been their position for many, many weeks, but it keeps getting reported as Hamas refuses to relinquish power. Hamas has said that it will relinquish power, and it's said that it will support an independent committee of Palestinians to come in and govern the Gaza Strip. What Israel did was to blow up that ceasefire by not participating in the negotiations, the technical negotiations for phase two. The next day, then, they imposed the full spectrum blockade on Gaza. And then on March 18th, Israel initiates a scorched earth terror bombing campaign that kills hundreds of people in its opening 24 hours, the majority of them women and children, and has continued to engage in heavy bombardment of Gaza ever since. So what now is on the table is something in the range of 45 days, an exchange of certain captives, and no guarantee that there will be any return to a framework that could lead to a permanent end to the war. Hamas has said, we won't engage anymore in these temporary deals unless there's a clear path back to phase two of the deal that we signed, that Israel signed, that the United States, Qatar, and Egypt were the guarantors of. So that's what's being presented right now to Hamas. Hamas countered and said, actually, we want to aim higher. We want something in the range of a 5 to 7 year deal, and we're willing to immediately release all of the Israeli captives. And what's interesting, you mentioned earlier about Donald Trump versus Joe Biden. I've also heard from sources within the Palestinian resistance. They understand very well who Donald Trump is. They know that Steve Witkoff is a dedicated Zionist. They don't believe that they're dealing with independent brokers. But what they're saying is, for the first time in this process, we saw people actually force Netanyahu to come to the table and make a deal that wasn't part of his entirely maximalist agenda. So in a way right now, Mohammed, the only hope of something happening really relies on Donald Trump. He has his visit coming up to Saudi Arabia and Qatar and the Emirates soon. There's a lot of indications that he wants, he doesn't want there to be this open military scorched earth bombing going on when he goes there. But that's what Hamas is facing right now, is basically Israel has said, we're not doing a hudna with you. And you need to engage in a short-term deal that includes your disarmament and does not offer any clear path to negotiating a permanent ceasefire.
Well, one thing has remained true from day one of this assault, and actually has always remained true throughout the previous assaults on Gaza, which is that they end when the United States tells Israel to end. That is the bottom line. The one power in the world that has the ability to force Netanyahu overnight to stop his bombing anywhere in the world is the United States and the United States president. That was true under Joe Biden. It happened in 2021. It was true under Barack Obama in 2014 and 2008, 2009. And it's true now. Like I said, the first time anyone applied any real pressure on Netanyahu to commit to a ceasefire was when when Steve Witkoff traveled to Tel Aviv and told told Netanyahu, you're signing the ceasefire deal now. Donald Trump does not want the war to be ongoing while he's being inaugurated. Now, so that truly remains the case. Whatever the Egyptians or the Qataris or anyone else says, the Israelis rely on the United States for everything in this war, primarily for weaponry and also diplomatic cover. So when the United States says stop, the Israelis will stop. I want to go back to a couple of things you mentioned earlier when you talked about the role that the Egyptians are playing in putting a lot of pressure on Hamas to accept these new Israeli terms. This is actually pretty much par for the course for Egypt in its role as a mediator between Israel and Hamas. In all previous rounds, Egypt has taken a very pro-Israel line, very tough on Hamas. And that's actually that kind of outlook has been what's enabled Qatar, this small Gulf country, to emerge as a power broker when it comes to international negotiations, and especially between Israelis and Palestinians, because they're seen as a more fair and a more even-handed negotiator or a mediator, between the Israelis and the Palestinians. So what the Egyptians are doing right now is not a surprise. It's also not a surprise that these new Israeli terms, which are on the face of them unacceptable to Palestinians, are being presented through through Egypt. The second thing I want to say is you mentioned Hamas saying that they'd be willing to step down from power in Gaza as part of a final truce. Hamas has been offering this since 2014. Hamas does not and has not wanted to take on the burden of governing Gaza for more than 10 years now. Gaza has been in a state of closure since the early 90s. By Israel. Its economy has been deliberately de-developed. It has been under a crippling siege since 2007, where the Israelis at one point admitted they were counting the amount of calories that they were allowing into Gaza. So Hamas does not want that burden. What they refuse to do, though, is disarm, because disarmament opens up the Palestinians to slaughter. I mean, the Israelis themselves are giving Hamas no incentive to give up their arms, because what they're saying plainly is that the goal is not to reach a ceasefire or a truce. The goal is to empty Gaza of Palestinians. And if you, as the prime resistance movement in Gaza, give up your arms, all you're doing is making the displacement of your people much easier for the Israelis to carry out. The Israelis have been very open that ethnic cleansing is their goal. Seeing is an attempt by Israel to try and force through, like we said earlier, the pressure campaign that's being waged on civilians by cutting off food, by killing women and children en masse, to force Hamas to come to an agreement or come to to agree to things that have always been a red line for the Palestinian resistance. My analysis is that will not happen. It would be suicide for Hamas as a movement, but also suicide for the Palestinian cause. And I think Palestinians are very aware of that. There have been historical precedents during the 1947-1948 war, when Palestinians were pretty much disarmed by what was at the time the British occupation. It made it far easier for Zionist militias to then take over and displace 750,000 Palestinians so that they could create the state of Israel on the ruins of their towns and villages. In 1982, the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, agreed to leave Lebanon under a U.S. guarantee that the Palestinian refugees in Lebanon would be kept safe. And 2 weeks later, the Sabra and Shatila massacre took place under Israeli auspices. So there's no historical incentive, and there's no current incentive for Hamas or any other resistance movement to give up their weapons in the face of Israel's very clearly stated goals of ethnic cleansing.
Yeah, I mean, there's also the practical issue here that I've heard also from some people within Hamas and Islamic Jihad, which is that, Hamas doesn't really have the right to sign that term over. If they, there are commanders on the ground of various factions. I mean, everyone uses the term Hamas, but there are multiple Palestinian factions with different political outlooks that have been participating in armed struggle against Israel for decades and since October 7th and on October 7th itself. But there's also this issue that, Israel and the United States both have promoted this notion that to defend the right of Palestinians, which all people in the world have, to use arms to try to fight against occupation, to try to defeat an apartheid occupying force, that necessarily must be categorized as terrorism. This is, this was also how Nelson Mandela and the armed wing of the African National Congress were characterized. But in the Palestine example, it's far more intense of a misportrayal of a whole group of people in an effort to undermine legitimate rights that are protected under international law and historical precedent. So, there's the practical aspect of this, which is, even if some officials that say we represent Hamas sign a piece of paper with Israel, that doesn't mean that every Palestinian is going to say, oh, we're also going to lay down our arms, because, as you say, history shows this would be suicide on the part of the Palestinians. And the narrative and the use of the term terrorism is quite incendiary in these cases. I mean, the very definition of terrorism is what we're witnessing on a daily basis being inflicted on the people of Gaza, where you are targeting civilians in an effort to try to change or alter a policy. That's the officially stated agenda of Israel right now. And it's not just the bombs, it's also the food.
They say it openly. Yeah.
Right. So on this issue of disarmament, I for people that say, well, if Hamas just agrees to lay down its arms, they're the ones pretending that Hamas speaks for all Palestinians, which is certainly not the case. And there's no guarantee that any Palestinian is going to listen to what any of the political figures of Hamas say if they make such an agreement. I mean, maybe Hamas can control some aspects of this, but there may even be commanders within the Qassam brigades that say, absolutely not. This would be to disrespect the blood of all of our martyrs if we now lay down our weapons.
I mean, it's not even, you don't even have to kind of go that far. It is, these people understand that if they give up their weapons, they become sitting ducks. It's as simple as that. There's no guarantee. Look, in previous historical examples that I gave, there was an attempt by other powers to convince the Palestinians that there would be a guarantee of their safety if they did disarm or give up their arms. There isn't even that pretense anymore. The Israelis and the Americans are saying the goal is that we're going to kick you out of your home, we're going to ethnically cleanse you, right? So this notion that if Hamas disarms, the Palestinians will be better off is bellied by the fact that day in, day out, the Israelis are saying, no, actually what we want to do is kill all these people and force the rest to leave. So this is why when I say these terms are unacceptable, it's not just unacceptable in a kind of on a principled level, it's unacceptable on a practical level. You're asking people to willingly give themselves up to the slaughter.